Okay, great. And so that's actually where part of, and there's a movie out now about part of the development of the atomic bomb occurred. And there was a lot of acreage there, a lot of sagebrush, high desert, high elevation desert. And they didn't need that after World War II. So they partitioned it off and sold it to returning veterans. And that was my dad. So that's how he and my mother homesteaded there in 1948. And I was born in 1949. So I grew up quite frankly, on a real homesteaded ranch. My parents lived in a tent the first year. And I spent probably the first 3 years of my life in that, both in the tent and in what we called were cookhouses for sheep herders. So no central heating. People pay to do that these days. They go out and rough it, right? But I didn't know that it was roughing growing up. That was just part of normal. So the picture you're seeing right now is the nearest post office, which is quite a few miles away. It still looks like that. It's just a little white building. Looking to the west, we could see Mount Rainier over here on the right, Mount Adams. We used to be able to see Mount St. Helens, but it got a little shorter in 1980 when it erupted. And this is the field across from our ranch, and it actually still looks like that. Rattlesnake Hills and irrigation and ranching. Growing up, there were no city lights. There were no bright night lights. You actually could see the Milky Way coming out of the mountains, really dark. And that's was really piqued my interest in space. But a lot of other things were going on too. So I'll talk about those in a minute. I was the oldest of 4 children, and my dad believed in a little bit of calculated risk. This was his prize Hereford bull. He's standing behind me, kind of holding me on there. And it was a calculated risk. It was this bull was probably tamer than most dogs. And me on the back. And I've shown this to school kids and even teachers when I talk about pathways and development and interests. And invariably, I'll get the comment about, well, wasn't your mother really horrified? Well, you can see there's not a lot around there, and you have to ask who's taking the picture. It was my mom. So this is one of my favorites, is kind of, look, Ma, no hands. And I hope that one is showing. So this was my growing up on the Diamond Double Bar Ranch with 2 younger brothers. 10 years later, after my birth, my sister was born. So she's not in these pictures. She was quite a bit younger. We had crops. So we were part of 4-H, raising cattle, and my brother had sheep, and we used our horses for roundup. It was part of life. It's not just Yellowstone on TV and the Dutton Ranch. It was a real working ranch, and it was until just a few years ago. So the Milky Way, that's our solar system, our galaxy, and it is one of billions of galaxies we know. And if you've got a dark sky, you have an opportunity to see, that we're not alone as a star. It's a very big place, and there's still much to learn. And I was very curious. My mother bought a set of encyclopedias for us when I was very young. And her favorite phrase was, look it up. Ask her a question, look it up. And we finally got a TV when I was about 9, black and white, 1 channel, broadcasting from Yakima, which also, by the way, is a navigation aid if you happen to be flying in the Northwest. And the Saturday morning program that we all watched was a program called Mr. Wizard. He would bring black and white, no special effects, bring a young boy and girl, usually middle school age, into his laboratory. He was a teacher, and he would teach basic physics, fundamentals of physics and chemistry. And so Saturday mornings was kind of my school for topics that would later come in junior high and high school. And we loved it. I went to a very small school, 22 in my class for 8 grades. And when I was 8 years old, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was a pretty sobering event for most adults that had just come out of World War II. But for myself, reading science fiction at the time, it was an entry into space. We had, during the summers, we had a bookmobile. It was a small van that would come around to all the ranches once a month. You could check out 10 books at a time. And I tried to check out all of the science fiction that I could find. Flash Gordon and Jules Verne. And this is a very famous book, Jules Verne, From Earth to the Moon. And in fact, it's one that the Blue Origin Company uses as kind of a symbol of what they're doing in trying to go to the moon. And Jeff Bezos has one of the original copies of this particular book. Well, then the space race was on. The Soviets started launching dogs. We were launching chimpanzees to determine whether humans, the mammals, could actually survive in a weightless environment. Putting people into space, the Russians put Yuri Gagarin in space. And then we launched a suborbital flight in 1961 with Alan Shepard. We defined space. It's an arbitrary altitude of about 50 miles. And this was our first astronaut. You can become an astronaut once you exceed that altitude. Some of you might become astronauts in the future, either through a program or buying a ticket. You know, that's where we're going in the future. But this was suborbital, didn't do one orbit, but neither did Yuri Gagarin. The Soviet Union was about 13 time zones wide at that time. So he launched from one side of the country and landed in the other, not quite one complete orbit. It wasn't until we launched John Glenn. Oops. My picture is suddenly graying out. I don't know if you can see that there.
We see Alan Shepard.
Okay, I've got to wait for a little bit. It's catching up on, I think, the comm here. So I'll talk a little bit about the nifty suits. Got to wait a minute, it won't let me change. So space is a hazardous environment. Oh, this is cute. I think it just rebooted.
Oh no, yeah, we just see you now. Your presentation no longer.
Well, let's do this again.
At least we're getting practice.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of practice. Okay, let me see whether I can.
Don't worry, we have a tech wizard here in Hannah, so hopefully she'll be able to help us again.
Yeah, I'm going to get caught up here in a minute. Okay. Well, okay, we're going to try this again.
We see John Glenn.
I think I need to move a little bit slower. So, yeah. So we finally launched John Glenn in 1962. And he actually did 3 orbits. So he then exceeded what Yuri Gagarin had done. He eventually flew on the space shuttle. That's why you see 2 pictures of him in when did he fly? In the 90s. And he was 77 when he flew. So there's a lot of hope for older people anyway. This really then allowed the nation, and especially President John Kennedy, to recognize that we had some success here. And so we can try to achieve the goal that he set for the nation in 1962. I listened to this speech. It was in the Rice Stadium in Houston, and it's very famous. You can actually find it on YouTube, but it was broadcast through the school radio. Of course, we didn't have internet, we didn't have TV, but they put the radio on the intercom so that we could hear it. And these are very famous words, but I think they're words that live forever. They have longevity for any generation. He said, "This generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space, but mean to be a part of it we mean to lead it. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. The growth of our science and education will be enriched by new knowledge of our universe and our environment. And so it has been. Unlike the Soviet program, which was a strictly military program, President Kennedy made NASA, which was established in 1958, a civilian program. And the NASA budget then, and still does, invests money in universities and research, in new innovations, and shares those innovations with the American public. You have the opportunity in Florida, and I hope you've done that, to visit the Kennedy Space Center and the Visitor Center there, because they do an actually pretty good job of not just capturing history, but talking about technology. And it's there that we also every year meet with many of the students that the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation provides support for. And if you have that opportunity to learn about those programs, I suggest you do. So this is all happening, and I'm still growing up. I get to the 8th grade, and I talked to my 6th grade teacher, who was my 8th grade teacher, who was also the principal of the high school, Mr. Miller, about what classes I should take when I take a bus into the nearest town to go to high school. So, for us, busing started back in the 60s. The grade school I went to was rural, but the nearest town was about 13, 15 miles away, Sunnyside High School. So I asked Mr. Miller what I should take, and he said, "What do you want to become?" And I said, "Well, I would like to build spaceships and fly in them." And he said, "You'll need to take algebra." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Trust me." So I took algebra, and that led to geometry and trigonometry and math analysis. That allowed me to take physics and chemistry. And it was a small high school. We were able to take 2 years of Latin. We were required to have foreign language, and I was in debate and sports. Had a pretty well-rounded education, and I qualified to apply to a university with financial aid that came from a program called the National Defense Education Act. And so this was a program that was put together by Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy to help fund education for students who are qualified to study engineering and the physical sciences, or to become a teacher in those sciences. It lasted 5 years. Thousands of students went through it, and it enabled me to have a university education, because I was the first in my family to go to college, and ranching was not that profitable. But I had a real challenge in trying to figure out what to major in. So I went to see my physics teacher, Mr. Anderson, and asked him what I should major in. Told him again what I wanted to do, and he said, "Well, I think you should become an engineer." And I said, "What's that?" And once again, he said, "Trust me," which I did. So I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, College of Engineering, and there I met the head of the department in mining, metallurgical, and ceramic engineering, and he had a NASA grant. His name was Doc Muller. He was working on tiles for the space shuttle, and he wooed me to the department because he said that he would introduce me to NASA engineers. And for me, NASA engineers walked on water. So he sold me, and that's how I ended up in materials engineering, and eventually got a job with Rockwell working on the space shuttle. While there, I joined a group that was a co-ed auxiliary to the Air Force ROTC called Angel Flight. Angel Flight really helped boost my career as well, because it introduced me to General Tom Stafford, who was an Apollo astronaut and later led the test flight school at Edwards Air Force Base. And the detachment commander there, I think it's Colonel Harvey Prosser, actually introduced us, and it was a great conversation. I was friends with Tom most of his life, and then sadly he just passed away this year. We actually wore uniforms and had ranks and went to national meetings, and I looked at this as part of my professional development as an undergraduate, not just the courses. but being part of a larger organization and understanding both flight and military organizations. Well, during this time, we landed on the moon, Neil Armstrong, 1969. And we're coming up on the 45th anniversary up here. This summer, there'll be a lot of events going on at the Kennedy Space Center, at the Johnson Space Center. Keep your calendars open in case there's something you can watch or participate in. And that was quite exciting. We landed on the moon 6 times, 12 men have walked on the moon. And it not only allowed us to explore a foreign body, our own natural satellite, but it gave us a new view of the Earth. And from this came our programs on mission to planet Earth, new studies of geology, oceanography, and meteorology, all subjects that astronauts now study because we do Earth photography and we work with scientists to basically monitor and scientifically explore our own planet. Of all the missions that we accomplished, though, perhaps one of the most seminal missions, and it's probably important to look at in today's environment, was the joining of the Apollo vehicle, one of the last missions we flew, July of 1975, with the Russian Soyuz vehicle. Here in the picture, you can see Tom Stafford on the left, and the Russian commander, Anatoly Soloviev, who also conducted the first spacewalk for the Russians. And I got to know Anatoly quite well through the Association of Space Explorers. This mission, I think it's lost to history sometimes, but it was hoped that it would help to thaw the Cold War. It made a difference behind the scenes because the Americans and the cosmonauts, we created this organization called the Association of Space Explorers that still exists today and is composed of flyers, astronauts from more than 22 nations. Well, I graduated from the University of Washington, got a master's degree, and then was hired by Rockwell internationally. This is one of those dream jobs. Even if I had not become an astronaut, taken that path, I was given the opportunity to work on a brand new space vehicle. I mean, how exciting is that? We were located in Downey, California, the Rockwell International Space Division, but I was spending most weeks out at Edwards Air Force Base, actually Palmdale, working on Space Shuttle Columbia. And it was during this time that I applied for the 1978 astronaut class. I was not selected, but I was offered a job in mission control, which I accepted, and worked as a flight controller, guidance and navigation controller for a couple of years before I reapplied for the 1980 class and was selected. So yeah, I was pretty young then. And it was an exciting time. Second class of astronauts for the shuttle, but the shuttle had not yet flown. That would happen in 1981. And that was an exciting time. I know we flew the shuttle for 30 years. We take it for granted, 135 flights, but you've got to think about what this was like in 1981. First winged vehicle, launches like a rocket, lands like an airplane, has wings, is reusable. We built 5 vehicles. Each were certified for 100 flights, which I think we should still be flying it, quite frankly. And it could take up to 8 astronauts up and down. I was on a couple of those flights. And this vehicle actually paved the way for the science and engineering that we're doing on the International Space Station now. I was really privileged to have the opportunity to work on this ceramic thermal protection system that allowed it to be reusable. That was quite a technology innovation at the time. It's now being used by the Air Force on their X-37. It's being used on other vehicles now, such as, I believe it's SpaceX's vehicle. It's being used on the Boeing vehicle or variants of it. The launch side of it, we called a 2-stage launch, in that you have this orbiter attached to a large tank of hydrogen and oxygen that feeds through a large umbilical to 3 main engines, and then 2 solid rocket boosters on the side. You launch with the 3 engines and the 2 solid rocket boosters, or SRBs. When we run out of fuel on the SRBs, they're jettisoned and then they're reused. That's called first stage. And then we achieve orbit, whether it's 150 miles or 300 miles, using the fuel from the external tank. When we achieve orbit, then we drop that tank and it burns up in the Earth's atmosphere. We conduct a couple more burns on what we call the orbital maneuvering systems. Those are engines that only work in a vacuum, and then that puts us in our final orbit. Every mission's different. Altitudes differ, inclinations to the equator differ. It depends on the mission that we're flying. So the other thing that made the shuttle quite unique is the accommodations. And unlike the prior vehicles where you had a little capsule, first of all, the crew compartment, the cabin looked very much like an airliner. You had a flight deck. This is where most of the flight occurred, where we operated the robotic arm, where we could monitor the missions through overhead windows and back windows. And then we had this very large mid-deck, and it was in this pressurized part of the vehicle that we had the first fly-by-wire computers. In fact, the whole thing was run by computers. We had lockers for mundane things such as clothing and food, but we also would have almost up to 20 of these mid-deck lockers for research as well. Protein crystal growth, for example, started in these mid-deck lockers. We had an airlock for spacewalks, so hatches on both sides. Crew member ingresses, we close the hatch, we evacuate the air, open the outside hatch, and do a spacewalk. And not shown over here, but talked about quite frequently, was the waste management system, or the toilet, which actually worked quite well. And then over here, a galley for cooking. The bulk of the mission, though, occurred right here in the payload bay of the shuttle. Different for every flight, 60 feet long, 15 feet in diameter. And this photo is the European-built space laboratory connected to the crew compartment with a tunnel where we could translate back and forth. I flew 3 of these laboratory missions, really amazing capability, and it was a joint collaboration with the European Space Agency. And as you can see, this is the final configuration of the shuttle flight deck, fly-by-wire panels. Even though we have a couple thousand switches and circuit breakers here that's shown, and many of those are now replaced in commercial aircraft and military aircraft by flat screens. It really was a marvel of engineering. Run by 4 IBM computers and in redundant communications, exchanging data once every 40 milliseconds. Again, the first fly-by-wire vehicle that basically flew. It was being developed in parallel with the B-1 bomber, that same computer that was classified at the time. But you can say this is kind of the first civil vehicle that was fly-by-wire. And just a little bit closer view of the cockpit. Well, briefly going through my flights, the first one in 1985 was a space lab. It was a joint mission with West Germany. We had 5 Americans, 2 Germans, and a Dutchman in the crew, 8 up, 8 down. I trained for about 7 months in West Germany. It was before Germany was unified, so definitely West. There's some remarkable histories on some of these European astronauts we can talk about later. 7 days, 2 shifts. So we were working around the clock, 24 hours on that mission. My second flight, I operated the robotic arm, and we brought in the long duration exposure facility, which had been in Earth orbit for 5 years, collecting data mostly on the response of materials to the space environment. One of those responses it was looking at was orbital debris mapping. So, as you know, the orbital debris is a challenging problem that we're still faced with. This was only a benchmark in 1990, and orbital debris has increased significantly since that time. It was an 11-day mission. Only 5 of us on the flight because we didn't have a lab, so we were pretty well constrained to just the crew compartment. And then I trained also as an EVA crew member on that flight. This will give you a picture of what we were seeing. The LDAF was about 23,000 pounds, and this payload bay was 15 feet in diameter. This was 14 feet in diameter. So we had to rendezvous with it in Earth orbit, orbiting the Earth once every 90 minutes at 17,500 miles per hour. So orbital mechanics and good training help here. And I had a wonderful pilot, Dan Brandenstein. So we were able to capture it and then bring it into the payload bay of the shuttle and bring it home, and then provided invaluable data. We always have a little fun in our missions. So I know it's a little blurry, but we were supposed to be up over Christmas. We didn't launch in time, but this was one of our stealth photos that you probably will not see anywhere else but here, maybe somewhere online, who knows. My third flight was a Space Lab flight, and this extended the mission to 13 days. It was called an extended duration orbiter, just as the other one was. We were testing how long we could stay in orbit with the what we call consumables, the cryogenic fuel, for example, in the shuttle. We did not use solar rays. We used fuel cells, so we needed oxygen and hydrogen for them. And inside the laboratory, it was, if you look at station, you'll see a lot of heritage here. This was inside the Space Lab. Dr. Larry DeLucas was a protein crystallographer from the University of Alabama. He's working back at a glove box here. And I'm putting metal samples into a large furnace, and we're doing what's called directional solidification in a microgravity environment. Again, we were working 24 hours a day in 2 shifts. Well, I was back from that mission for a couple of years, and then I was asked to be part of a joint Russian-American venture, the first since Apollo-Soyuz, and it's a little complicated. But under the agreement we signed, which was called Phase 1A, we would send crews to the Russian space station Mir, and they would fly crews on the space shuttle. And we would see if we could work together well to help set the platform for building the International Space Station. I was selected on that first American crew to go to Russia to train. I was the backup to Norm Thagard. This was called Mir 18. And Norm did a launch from Russia, and then I came back and I joined the shuttle crew that was docked with the Russian space station Mir after 90 days to pick up Norm and his 2 Russian cosmonauts. But I also had to train with my own cosmonaut crew in Russia for 13 months in case something happened to Norm and his crew. So these are my 2 Russian cosmonaut colleagues. We're in Star City, Russia, in front of their vehicle called the Soyuz. So it's a little complicated. We got the Mir 18, the docking of the shuttle, the first docking with the Russian space station Mir, that was on STS-71. And I trained with both crews. Now, of course, we were the first joint crew of 10. There's all 10 of us up in the Mir space station. Of course, you can do a lot of things in weightlessness you cannot do on the surface of the Earth. And so we got all 10 of us in there. I have to tell you, it was quite exciting as we were rendezvousing with Mir. I was at the pilot's window using a ham radio to talk to the Mir, because that was the frequency we needed between the 2 vehicles. Their vehicle is communicating with their control center in Moscow. Our vehicle is communicating with our control center in Houston. I'm talking to the cosmonaut on the Mir about closing ranges, range and range rate. And I'll tell you, when I first looked out the window and saw it, it reminded me of when I watched the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey back in 1968, when there was a rotating space station. It was all science fiction, but it was pretty exciting at the time. Just a few photos from our training. Norm and I in the center here. I'm being fit with my pressure suit. This is called the Sokol pressure suit. Again, our 3 crew members, winter survival in Siberia, which was kind of interesting as well. And I'm not sure this is going to show up, maybe. Next slide, please. Here we go. And we also had water survival. We did that in a the great month of March 1994, which is pretty cold. This is Lake Voskresenia outside of Moscow, actually quite actually out of Star City. And this is the same lake where Yuri Gagarin did his water survival. It's out in the woods. It was kind of interesting as we were being fished out of the water and trying to stay warm. It's little special forces with their fire in the back. The local village kids came to visit with us. Security was a little lax, let's just put it that way. Training also included medical experiments. It's called a tilt table, where they're measuring blood pressure. And I have this interesting little cap on me that's looking at brain waves. They never did tell me what the results were. But at the end of that, then we signed Yuri Gagarin's logbook. And this is when we completed our training, myself and my commander, Anatoly Solovyev. We launched, of course, I launched on the shuttle later on. And so that picture that you see behind me when I'm on screen is a picture we took after we docked. And this is from the Russian space station Mir, looking out over the nose of the shuttle. And our starburst photos and just photos from being on board. We trained together. We were colleagues. It's like any air crew. You operate as a team, with safety being the first of the most paramount of the priorities. We conducted medical experiments in the space lab while we were docked. They had been conducting similar medical experiments for the 90 days before we got there. And they gave me the honor of putting the crew patch on the panel on the Mir under the picture of Yuri Gagarin. Unfortunately, the Mir has been deorbited, so that's all burned up, but at least it's there. And we tried our hand at singing. This is actually an IMAX film. You can see me mouth the words, but you don't want to hear me because I can't sing, actually. This was a lot of very, first. First of all, it was our first docking between the shuttle and the space station Mir in 1995. You're wondering how this picture occurred. That was because Anatoly undocked the Soyuz to take the picture. It was the very first three-body orbital mechanics operation in space as well. We have that a little more routine now, but this was quite unusual at the time. My last mission was the 8th docking mission to the Mir out of 9, and it was in 1998. We flew a Russian cosmonaut on our crew, Solozhan Sharpov. So we were flying Americans on the Soyuz to Mir, and we were flying Russian cosmonauts on the shuttle to Mir and trading crew members back and forth. And that gave us, this Phase A program, the confidence that we could actually work together in 2 languages, 2 different cultures, 2 different control centers, as a matter of fact, and starting out with 2 different philosophies towards safety that we started converging. So this was a fun flight. It was my last flight, kind of bittersweet, but a great crew. I was the payload commander on that flight. Again, we have a nice starburst photo. This was my commander, Terry Wilcutt. He was a Marine pilot, test pilot, and Top Gun pilot. He eventually became, after he retired from flying, he stayed with NASA and became head of safety. I think he's probably spent a lot of time down at the Cape as well. And just to prove I was there, I'm in the pilot seat, and Hoot Gibson, who had been one of my commanders, introduced us into EAA. And so we have our I Love EAA's logo up there for some of you. And here we are on entry, again, back in the pressure suits, and you can see our checklist. Looks like an airplane, right? For those of you that fly, live by the checklist, die by the checklist. And except we've got pressure suits on as we come in for the reentry. It's about a 45-minute reentry. You got to remember it's a glider. There's no go-around engines. The nav has to be pretty precise. And we enter at or land at about 195 knots on a pretty long runway. And that's after deorbiting at 17,500 miles per hour. So if you have any questions about that, happy to answer. First, when you're back on the ground, after you kiss the ground, right, you do your thumbs up just like any other pilot. Great mission. And because it was a glider, the the pilot and the commander congratulated each other for actually rolling out on the center line. It's not uncommon, but as congratulations are in order in any case. And that was my last flight, my last sunset, but not my last day at NASA. I went on to go into management there, and I'm just going to share with you a 2-minute clip. Hopefully there's sound in case you've never seen a launch. This just takes you through the SRB separation. It's a shock wave. I hope you saw that come through there as we go transonic. The SRB separate. We never had an unmanned flight to do this. This was probably the first flight that was completely modeled on computers, and I was just really impressed by how well it worked. So the shuttle was pretty remarkable. 135 flights, thousands of experiments, university faculty and students that had experiments. We did K through 12, graduate students, companies, 5 shuttles. We did lose 2, but if you look at the remarkable record of what we did in this program, I know those of us who worked on it quite proud of it. But in the end, if you are fortunate to work on a vehicle throughout its lifetime, from birth to the end, it's quite a feeling. And I feel very proud that was part of that program. And at the end of the program, we used the shuttle to start to build the International Space Station, which is now up there. And I hope you all use your app to find out when it's flying over wherever you are, which you can do that. My 96-year-old mother, she just passed away, but she was still doing that on her iPad and telling all the neighbors when the ISS was going to come over. Now, this is a large vehicle. This is larger than a football field. It's very international. It is U.S. And it has a U.S. laboratory. This happens to be the Japanese laboratory here called the GEM, and it has a little, what they call the back porch and a robotic arm. There are Russian modules and European modules. And the robotic arms, you kind of see it there, are built by the Canadians. They also built the shuttle's robotic arm as well. This gives you a little bit of scale with the shuttle, which is about the size of a 727 dock to the space station. I happen to like this slide because you see part of the star field. Carl Sagan used to say there are billions and billions of stars, and you really are impacted by that number when you're above the Earth's atmosphere in vacuum. It's a little hard even to pick out the constellations because they're obscured by all the other stars. So it gives one a feel for this vastness of this universe that we have. We've now been flying this station for more than 24 years with an international collaborative partnership, and the Russians are still flying with us. It's been pretty remarkable, but their space agency and their cosmonauts have been able to kind of carve out some space away from what's happening with the rest of the country. We hope that continues, but with this recent alliance between Russia and China, we'll see how that folds out in the next few years. So we've had over 200 people fly, and probably close to 300 now on the International Space Station from all the partner nations. It's really been a remarkable program. Now, what I do at Texas A&M is try to help prepare engineers and that next generation to go to the next steps. I work on advanced spacesuits and fluid physics in reduced gravity environments, and I won't go into depth into that right now. But just to give you a quick look of what's next, the moon and Mars. NASA uses this slide to call the journey to Mars. It's all stepping stones. We've got the International Space Station. We have Orion going to the moon. We have robotic and unmanned rovers, both on the moon and onto Mars. But eventually the goal is to put humans on Mars by 2039. The moon is the next step, returning there. That's the Artemis mission. We plan to land on the South Pole because of the near continuous sunlight, unlike being on the mid-level latitudes where you might be half of the month without sunlight. And because there are some very deep craters on the South Pole that we believe have ice water in them, and that can be thought as a water source. So it's called the Artemis mission to moon. Artemis was the sister of Apollo. And we have, as you're probably reading the news, a lot of activity going on. And hopefully we'll be back on the surface by 2026. It may be 2027. Many components to this mission architecture, as we call it. We have the launch system, which has launched, and the next mission will take a crew around the moon. I believe that's going to be possibly later this year, early next year, in an Orion spacecraft. There'll be several different landing systems. The first one will be SpaceX. We'll conduct surface operations. We're going to build a space station that will orbit the moon, called the Gateway. There's infrastructure that's being developed, ground systems, space communication systems. For the moon, we're also looking at new rovers and surface mobility, new spacesuits. 2 companies have been selected, Axiom and Collins, to build 2 new suits. And this is a concept for the Artemis Base Camp. And I won't go into all of this here, but if you've heard the word ConOps, or concept of operations, this is kind of what it's all about, the various pieces that need to work. The first Artemis mission, which was conducted just to put the capsule around the moon. Artemis 2, to put humans in around the moon but not land. Putting up the Gateway space station. Eventually we get crews on the surface. The base camp will build up gradually, and it's not just government. This is where you see all of these different companies competing with the opportunities to put landers on the surface successfully, and even possibly mine on the moon, something called in situ resource utilization. Gateway is underway, being built. It'll have an international collaboration. I don't know that this is the final configuration drawing, but it's on a fast track. And no doubt you've been watching the news about SpaceX and their test program out of Texas to try to get this very large rocket into Earth orbit and to be a reusable rocket. And for scale, look down here at the bottom, and those little bitty figures are the crew members. Now we're still continuing with other landing system concepts. Blue Origin has a concept that they're working on as well, and that redundancy of design will help us increase the probability of success. Habitats are being not built right now, but certainly being developed in terms of both technology and different approaches. I think that one that's really interesting are these inflatable habitats, low mass, being inflated in place. And we would hopefully make them mobile as well so that we can work at different places on the moon. We're looking at fission power because we need power, more power than the sun can give us, or solar rays on the surface of the moon, and definitely on the surface of Mars. And if we're going to extract oxygen from the regolith or water from the deep part of an impact crater, then we need power to operate these little small chemical processing facilities. And again, we call it in situ resource utilization. This is a very old slide. I've had it for 30 years. 30 years ago, this definitely was science fiction, but this was a vision of a lunar base. I think we're getting closer and closer to it. definitely in the lifetime of some of you in this room. Eventually, we'll go to Mars. And again, what we might learn on inflatable habitats might be part of this transit vehicle to Mars. Many things we need to learn from being on the moon for these very long missions, a 3-year mission possibly to get to the big red planet. If you watch the movie The Martian, there was quite a bit of collaboration from NASA in that with the author. But we're learning from our robotic rovers what the risks are, and we hopefully are learning how to mitigate those on the moon, so that this first reference mission, we're calling it, in 2039, will allow us to put people in orbit, maybe 2 in orbit, and then put the other 2 on the surface of Mars. And there's a lot of discussion about that length of that surface mission, whether it's 30 days or more, and that's still being worked. And so this might be the Martian base. Small, very small carbon dioxide atmosphere might be processed to extract oxygen for breathing or even make water. Robotic vehicles that are voice commanded, new EVA suits. It's pretty exciting concepts. And again, we're looking at this experience on the moon to help reduce risk as we go on to Mars in a lot of different areas. Well, this slide I've had for, I don't know, several decades, because it reminded me of a quote by Robert Goddard. Now, Robert Goddard was born in the same year as my grandfather, 1887. And in the 1920s, growing up on the East Coast, he was valedictorian of his class, and he was invited to give the graduation speech. He had become very interested in spaceflight reading and some of those original authors, science fiction and so forth. And he said, it's difficult to say what is impossible, for the dreams of yesterday become the hopes of today and the realities of tomorrow. This visionary went on to start working with liquid-fueled rockets, eventually in New Mexico, and is known as the father of modern rocketry. But he was not alive when we launched to the moon. And there's an interesting story here. When he gave his first lecture as a physicist in New York in the 20s about going to Mars and using liquid-fueled rockets, the New York Times published a rather critical article saying that even the simplest high school student knew that liquid-fueled rockets wouldn't work in the vacuum of space. That didn't deter him. There was no Twitter out there to criticize him or social media to make him feel bad. He just continued on. And on the day that Neil Armstrong and his crew launched to the moon, the New York Times published a public apology to Dr. Robert Goddard on the front page of the New York Times. So I hope we remember what those lessons are in vision and tenacity and fortitude in achieving our dreams, whether they're in airplanes and terrestrial flight or in space. It's difficult to say what is impossible, for the dreams of yesterday become the hopes of today and the realities of tomorrow. So thank you very much for your patience. I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Dunbar. If you'll just bear with me for just a second, I'm going to get our speaker system set up here, our microphones, so that I can pass it around for people to ask questions. Testing.
Testing. Hey, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Hi, I don't have a question. Let me see, am I in the camera? Or doesn't matter, I guess. I have a comment. You mentioned Apollo Soyuz. In summer of 1975, I was taking a summer school class at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I happened to have the rock top 40 station on my AM radio, WABC New York, and the DJ was saying, I guess when the two spaceships met, um, it was in the radio station. I mean, they heard about it, and the DJ said, right now in Mission Control in Moscow, they're listening live to WABC radio, and we're playing with the #1 song in America, Frankie Valli's "Swear to God." And for an atheist country, I wonder if they heard that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, could you just repeat that, that they heard what?
The song was Frankie Valli's "Swear to God."
Oh,
Yep.
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Hannah.
So while you were up in space, how did you get oxygen supplied? Was it like reused, or did you have like a air container, or how did that work?
You mean inside the shuttle?
Yes.
Okay, so we had cryogenic fuel tanks in the payload bay underneath the liner. And the oxygen, and we breathed oxygen and nitrogen, standard atmospheric mixture that we do here at the same pressure, 14.7 psi. But the cryogenic oxygen, also we had the tanks for the fuel cells, and there it was oxygen and hydrogen that was used for the fuel cells, and the byproduct was water, H2O. So that supplied our water.
Good.
Pardon?
That's very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And it worked quite well.
Thanks, Hannah. Yes, Judy.
Thank you, Dr. Dunbar, for an amazing and fascinating presentation. We really, really enjoyed it. And I have a question for you. After you finish traveling to space, after your shuttle missions, and then working in the human systems, if I'm not mistaken, how have things changed now in your job as far as human safety and so on compared to how things were addressed when you were an astronaut?
Well, first of all, just as in aviation, safety is paramount. And it always was when I was flying. And the only thing I think has changed is that when I was flying, it was a government program, and safety was embedded in the culture. Now, yes, we had 2 accidents, and we do safety investigations because you're operating right at the edge, right? This is not everyday stuff, and it's easy to point fingers. And I don't always point my fingers at the engineers. Sometimes you don't get the resources from Congress you need to actually do the job you're expected to do as well. So we make certain that people feel empowered to raise their hand if they don't feel they have the resources or they're being pressured. What has changed is that we always had oversight from NASA headquarters or the safety organizations. But now we have a lot of new players out there, right? And commercial space. And we have the only oversight we have is some oversight in terms of certification if they're flying NASA astronauts. But if they're strictly a commercial entity that's flying civilians, they're now pretty much monitored by the FAA. Okay, for example, Virgin Galactic, which is just going up to that 50 miles, for example. And so you hope that they have the same rigor on safety as we try to put into general aviation or into commercial aviation, and put that into commercial space flight. That has changed, and I think even Virgin Galactic recognizes this, or recognized it at a talk I heard several years ago, is that you cannot take your eye off the ball, because especially in a new program, any program, because the first time you have a real problem, a catastrophe in let's say a commercial space flight with passengers, there's going to be a tendency to say, hey, stop, this is no longer safe. I think what's going to be important is that you don't take your eye off the ball, But if things do happen, you do follow the normal process of trying to recover and make it better. Because if we had stopped every time we had a problem in the past, we wouldn't be flying in airplanes. I go back to the Wright brothers. They had a hard time selling their design. Even the New York Times is very famous for these types of quotes. No one will ever buy a ticket to fly this contraption. It's deadly. And so the Wright brothers sold their plans to the Army, right? There was no Air Force. And they were trying to get, it might be better than putting up these balloons to look over the front line, And it was actually, I think, a combination of the military and the federally owned airmail at that time. They helped to push aviation forward, as well as 2 world wars, when the airplane really made a difference. And NACA, which preceded NASA, was established to help do research in new technology to make it work. But if we'd stopped flying just because we had losses, we'd still be horse and buggy. When I used to give speeches about 30, 40 years ago, I had and I did research in history. I actually had a quote from a town mayor, I think in Ohio, that was objecting to the fact that automobiles were starting to come into his town. He says, people were not meant to travel more than 20 miles an hour. And they didn't, and it was Wild West in automobiles for a long period of time. There were no rules, no stoplights. So you want to be safe. You never take your eye off the ball, but you recover whenever you have a problem. That's a long answer, but I think we're at that point now that we got a large commercial industry growing, and you hope that they keep their eye on the ball.
Great question, Judith Ann. Yes. Oh, okay. Here.
Hello. My question is more like for the new generation that want to be an astronaut. So you said that you tried first time, you were not chosen. The second time you try and you were chosen. So my question is, what are the qualifications that are they looking for to be an astronaut? And what do you do different for the second try?
Well, for me personally, are where they published. So the qualifications for being an astronaut, if you want to apply, are on the NASA website. But when I applied for the first group, which was the class for shuttle, there were 35 selected, a combination of civilians and military. I'm a civilian, and I recognized that of the civilians that were selected, all of them had doctoral degrees, and I had a master's degree. And I was able to get a copy, or to obtain a copy of my evaluation, not ranked to other people, but it was clear, like any other job, that I passed the physical, but I just simply wasn't competitive. So when I went to NASA, I started night school towards a PhD at the University of Houston. It took me about 5 years, but I eventually got my doctoral degree, and that made me more competitive.
Great question. Yes, Maggie.
I was just wondering, as a pilot, and if anytime I go to do like a new rating or do another a check ride or something, I have a pre-check ride or pre-flight rituals, like something that I will eat or something that I will do or something. And I was wondering if you had any sort of things before each mission that either you and your crew did together, or something that you yourself kind of made into a little habit, maybe superstition based, or just kind of hoping for good luck.
I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't hear all of it for some reason.
Do I need to move up, or?
No, it's just there was a little bit of a warble that came in at my end. So just
Okay, what did you hear? Just so I can make sure.
Something that you want me to talk about in terms of my last crew?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if you had any pre-mission rituals or like sort of not like superstitions or habits or something that either you did yourself or you and your crew did before each mission for for good luck?
You know, I'm trying to remember. There was a tradition that I think faded with some of us, new guys. You know, I think the American crews used to watch Casablanca, and the Russian crews also had a tradition. It was a kind of a spaghetti western in Russian about being in the desert, and it's kind of hard to explain, but. You know, it was a comedy. So we watched that in quarantine when I was in Russia. And then there were some movies there. I can't think of any special traditions. In Russia, in crew quarters, everybody would sign the door as they left. I don't think NASA would appreciate it if we used a Sharpie to all sign our doors. So, but we didn't need those kinds of traditions anyway.
So I know you said you flew 5 separate missions. Were you a payload specialist for every single mission, or did you play different roles depending on whatever the missions were for?
Well, the professional astronauts are either pilots or mission specialists. I was a mission specialist. Payload specialists are from the external research community, and they usually fly one mission. So I was with NASA for nearly 30 years. Of my 5 missions, on 2 of those as a mission specialist, I was also payload commander, which meant I was in charge of the research and the mission operations, not flying the shuttle, but assigning crews to doing different experiments or different operations, and then representing that to the customers, whoever they were.
All right, so I have another question for you. So while you were in Russia, did you get to learn the Russian language? Because I know that like on the ISS, there's kind of like a dialect between Russian and English. So was that kind of like an integral part of your journeys and that kind of stuff? Or was it strictly English?
When I trained in Russia, you were only allowed to use Russian. We studied Russian 4 hours a day. You had to take all the exams in Russian. You had to do all the checklists were in Russian. You had to go through simulations and operations, and then you had to be certified, but it was all in Russian.
Wow, that's incredible. Jenny, yes.
I've forgotten most of it, but sometimes I dream in it. So.
Well, Professor Dunbar, thank you so much, not only for your presentation, but for your contributions to humanity in terms of science, both as an explorer and also as a researcher. I have a myriad amount of questions for you, but I'm going to try to limit it to just a few.
Okay.
The first one is for someone who has one foot in aviation and aerospace and the other foot in the healthcare profession. What recommendations would you have, either in terms of exploring more in terms of human systems and research or other opportunities?
Well, from a flight crew point of view, our mission specialists come from many disciplines, engineering, science, but also flight medicine. So we've flown flight surgeons and physiologists in space. We flew a veterinarian on one of the Space Lab missions who dissected rats in a glove box. But we have a big demand for physiologists and flight surgeons helping to do the research on the ground in terms of preparing to put people on the moon for long periods of time. And we didn't talk about some of the other hazards like the radiation environment, the galactic cosmic rays, human performance, working in pressure suits, all of those. So if you look at the companies like Axiom and Collins building the new spacesuit, they need people to understand human physiology. And I teach some of that intersection between the engineering and what keeps a human alive in one of my classes called bioastronautics and human systems integration. So that's a logical intersection when you're working in human spaceflight.
Thank you. One follow-up question, if I may. So if you happen to find other individuals in this galaxy that are interested in those things, do you ever provide opportunities for a few questions on the side or for mentorship?
If I do, I entertain questions outside this. Is that what it is?
That's correct.
Yeah, all the time. So my email is on the Texas A&M Aerospace Engineering Faculty website. So I'm happy to try to answer questions.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good evening, Doctor, and thank you. As a pilot bringing, is it back?
Oh, did we get it?
Check. Yep, we're back. All right. No worries. I was just curious. Obviously, we're having flown a space shuttle. I fly an Airbus. It's quite the opposite. My husband and I often joke that coming into land must be like doing a power off 180 from space. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Say again that you're doing what?
A power off 180. It was a maneuver we used to do in primary. I'm sure you've done it in primary flight training, where basically, you know, on that base leg downwind, you cut your engine and just swoop in.
So the analogy there is landing the shuttle as a glider. So the difference probably is airspeed and descent rate. So you might want to pull up, I think you can still get that information online about what the glide slope looked like for the shuttle. It's a 17-degree glide slope, I believe. And it's kind of diving at the ground, and then it hits what you would call the VASI lights. And then in order to kind of break its descent rate, and you have to follow the guidance needles pretty well because there's no go around, right?
That's amazing. And it must also feel weird going from 17,000 miles an hour down to 190 knots. That's probably never felt slower, I imagine.
Well, the thing is, we don't know. I mean, if you're looking out the window, you can see that difference. But remember, most of that speed is lost from a half an orbit away. We start our descent, our deorbit burn, about half of an orbit away. And that's about a 45-minute journey. Most of that's going to be in vacuum. You're going to not start to get a real sense of speed until maybe about 50,000 feet if you happen to be looking at the ground. And then, of course, you're going to put the gear down. It'll be at about 195 knots. What you really sense is, especially if you're not looking out the window, it's not speed, but the onset of gravity, because you're now gone from a weightless environment. And we do a couple of S-turns as we're coming down, gliding down, and we're conserving energy. And so you might get about 2 to maybe 3 Gs on that. And then all of a sudden you're on 1 G and you feel like you're 1,000,000 pounds because you might have been at 0 G on my mission for 13 days, but maybe, for a year on the station. So there's a lot of body adaptation to this gravitational level on Earth.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Those are great questions. Okay, I'll take one more question and then let Dr. Dunbar go because I know it's getting late on her end. So, yes, Sharon. Oh, yeah, sorry, Sharon. You might have to come a little. We're getting your steps in today, Sharon. Here you go.
Hi, Doctor. I'm wondering about that first step out of your space vehicle and into space for the spacewalk.
Well, I trained as an EVA crew member, but as a contingency EVA crew member, which meant if something went wrong outside, we'd go fix it. We kept hoping a little thing would break, but it never did. So that's the best question for someone who was doing a planned EVA. But what I've been told by my colleagues is that the biggest difference is that you're in your spacesuit, you typically have a helmet that is, if you have the sunshade up, is one layer. Whereas on the shuttle, although we see it's very clear to us, there's still 3 panes of quartz glass there, for protection and UV and so forth. And they tell me that the biggest impact is that clarity when you egress the airlock and it's just you and you've got this bubble helmet around you, not a flat plane of glass, and you're suddenly out in the universe. You're now an orbiting spacecraft.
Wow, what an incredible and terrifying and amazing experience. Okay, well, I think we'll end the question and answering period now. Thank you so much, Dr. Dunbar, for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with us and to share your incredible journey. Can I please get a round of applause?
Well, I want to thank you for your patience as we got started. Thank you for the tech support. I don't usually have a Google setup, Google Link or something. and I really appreciated you helping to get this back on board. Great audience.
Absolutely. And special thanks to Hannah for the technical assistance there. We really appreciate it. So, well, thank you so much, Dr. Dunbar. We'll definitely let you go and get on with your evening. And thank you again for your time and your incredible story.
Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Thank you.